Welcome, everybody, to a very new special episode of the Jams and Tea podcast where we decide to talk about whatever the fuck we feel like because we can just do that now. And I, today, am here with Tyler. We are recording this just before Christmas, so Merry Christmas to all who celebrate. Happy holidays to those who don't. And we're here to present another, it's sort of a similar deal to the SOPHIE episode that we did very recently, where it was just the two of us going over a particular project that the two of us are really interested in covering and talking about. And in that vein, we are talking about the KicK series from musical artist Arca, the 5 albums in the sort of series of records that are under the KicK name, KicK 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. KicK was released last year with the promise of more records coming on in the future. We actually covered that album very early on in our podcast tenure. And then suddenly this month, she elected to drop all 4 remaining projects in this series right now. So these all just kind of exist for us to sort of tear into. And I am not exactly the Arca expert here. That would, of course, be Tyler. So if you want to give us a more in-depth sort of overview as to what we're actually getting into here, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Absolutely, happy to. So podcast channel subscribers will know that just a few days ago over the weekend, we put out our best albums of the year video. And this, obviously, this Arca project really snuck up on us. If you've seen our original Arca review, you'll know that Arca's a kind of a divisive artist, not necessarily attuned to the tastes of a lot of the members of this podcast, which is fine. But so it made sense in my head that, well, one, this project is so big and so significant that it would feel like a massive oversight not to discuss it in any way. And two, yes, I don't necessarily want to subject Morgan and August to this 3-hour project that they're likely not going to have much of a personal interest in, although I could be wrong. But also, like, Jake very quickly signaled his interest in talking with me about these records. And so it made sense, especially, I'm glad you referred to the SOPHIE video we did as well, because that we did that, I think, just before or around the time that these albums dropped. And obviously these are two artists who are heavily cut from similar cloths, incredibly influential producers with a very distinct but not dissimilar styles. I mean, you even have a collaboration between the two in the first KicK installment. And so it made sense to me to use this format that we used for that video, which I think was a really great video, and talk about this project, which does sort of similar to Oil of Every Pearl's and Insights. It works as kind of like a grand statement for the artist, like a kind of like opus that represents all of their musical developments up to this point, as well as their current interests in terms of style and sound and atmospherics and all those kinds of things going forward. Like Oil, this feels like a definitive statement of identity for Arca as well, and I feel like, as someone who's followed Arca pretty strongly ever since she really kind of came into the scene in the early 2010s, every record she's put out, or her main studio records, really do feel like a statement of purpose, really do feel like a statement of intent, including, but not limited to, her fantastic 2017 self-titled record, which, you know, felt like the real arrival of Arca as not just a producer who can kind of like create these abrasive collages of sound like she did on her previous records, but also someone who's able to harness that into the form of songwriting and able to pull the listener through some devastating, well-constructed songs, as well as the more collagey, experimental, less formed, conventionally musical stuff that she does. And so the KicK series feels like Arca leveling up even further from there to really lay out this grand statement of who she is as a person, as a trans woman, who she is as a producer, who she is as a musician, who she is as an artist, and her distinct and fascinating views on identity and how identity is expressed through art and through music. And so there's a lot that Arca does on these records, and each record, I think, while I think of the KicK series as one big record, and I think we'll kind of treat it as such, the distinct parts that it has, the 5 distinct parts that it's comprised of, do have their own arcs within them do have their own sense of holistic completeness in and of themselves. An obvious reference point that I'm sure anyone who knows me relatively well was just waiting for me to bring up is that the structure here is not dissimilar to that of Autechre's LSEC project, which dropped in May of 2016 and similarly felt like a kind of bold sort of revealing of all of the sonic possibilities that act had kind of summoned up until that point, laid out and ambitiously kind of sprawled across these 5 distinct parts that each has its own mood and set of emotions and textures and all that sort of stuff. And so Arca seems to be utilizing that kind of structure to do something similar here. And I might circle back a little bit to this comparison when we kind of wrap up, because I don't want to linger on it too much, because obviously this is very much its own thing. But that definitely, because of the influence that Autechre have clearly had on artists like Arca and artists like SOPHIE, this kind of progressive electronic, futuristic version of electronica and IDM that flirts with influences that go beyond sort of the traditional electronic European influences to incorporate influences from Latin music, which we hear here in a lot of this KicK music and hip hop as well. Like that's the sort of shit that artists like Autechre were really breaking the mold and doing. And that's the sort of shit that artists like Arca and SOPHIE have really kind of built on in fascinating and interesting and really, really important ways in more recent years. So with that, let's revisit KicK 1, take our minds back to last year. I believe it came out in July of last year, the first installment in the KicK series, a divisive review. I remember I was pretty effusive in my praise, and I think that the rest of the members of the podcast were verging from ambivalent to cautiously positive. Jake, how do you want to kind of refresh our memory with how you feel about that, how you felt about that Arca project at the time, and how you feel about it now, and whether the passage of time has changed your feelings or the experience of listening to these records has changed your feelings at all?
Curiously enough, I actually think when it comes to this particular segment of the KicK project, the first one, I was the first on board with it because it leaked before its release date, several months in advance, to the point where I believe it had different album art too. But I had sort of gotten on that, and I only knew Arca from the work that she's done with Bjork. And that was sort of what got me interested. And I was just like, oh, the Bjork albums that she's produced and Bjork songs that she's produced are some of my favorites. So I was really on board with that. And I listened to it. And it was earlier before I had really branched out with my musical taste. So it was very alien and weird, but I knew that I definitely liked it. And that was before we started the podcast. But once we did, and it got formally released, I actually was the first person to push for us to review it. And if Tyler was the most positive on it, then I was easily the second most positive on it. And unsurprisingly, I think, to me, I guess in retrospect, I was taken with, when I revisited this, how much I liked it and how much more I just was able to appreciate it. It's really difficult to pigeonhole Arca as one thing, even in these distinct movements of the 5 KicK albums. They sort of have an overarching sound that they kind of abide by and do variations on. And even in this one sound, it's really difficult to just be like, oh, well, this is this. But here we have I sort of classify Arca as any given song for her that she makes, for me, is kind of it's either something really claustrophobic, really aggressive, and really rhythmic, or really spacious, really wide-reaching, and something that builds a soundscape to iterate upon it. And this is kind of an even, steady mix of what I would call Arca's base fundamental sound, is that you can kind of find elements of this album in pretty much everything that goes on from here, but really that's more of the broad conceptual part of this album, just because thematically it's a little bit difficult. Maybe that was why this ended up being so divisive on the podcast, is that you couldn't really get the full scope of what was intended, not even the way that this was a part of a greater whole, but in the sense that like recontextualized, this feels like a completely different project than if you hear it on its own, not knowing that it's supposed to be something else. Because it feels like this is sort of the declarative base statement that is then gradually deconstructed further and further and further with each iteration of the KicK project. It has like a really cool opening in non-binary, which, you know, that really just gives you all you need to know when it comes to the goals and trajectories of something like this, which is this really aggressive, it like samples a gunshot at one point, you hear like the little bullet fall out and like go across the floor. And it's this really hypersexual, neo-futuristic shit that's like really industrial and really metallic. It has a lot in common with SOPHIE's aesthetic, but I would say that they use their aesthetic in entirely different ways. Is that SOPHIE's is heavy and overwhelming and dense, whereas Arca's is razor sharp. It feels a little bit more honed to have a really deliberate, incisive effect on you that's like purposeful. Like, not to say that both artists aren't confrontational, but Arca very specifically is super confrontational across each of these albums. About the themes and about the sounds, from everything to songs that are even a little bit more spaced out. There's the Bjork collab on this particular album, which I think is one of the standout moments on the track, which really emphasizes that spacier sort of industrial thing, but like, you know, the emphasis on beauty sort of amidst all of this machinery kind of shit is a contrast that is really played up throughout these albums. And there are moments where they emphasize repetition and rhythm, and points where it's like so deliberately antagonistic to the point of borderline alienation. I will say, for as broadly as I think this is maybe one of the stronger parts of this, I'd say maybe there are like two other parts of this that I would prefer, but I would put this like solidly in the middle of all five of them. But like, I think like the first half of this is basically as consistent as this gets. I'm not as fond as moments like Rip the Slits and the following song, La Chiqui, which are these moments where, again, it's so abrasive and repetitive and it just kind of beats you into the ground with it. And it's like, it accomplishes its goals. It's just to actually sit and listen to it. But even then, it's like, in the context of this entire project, I can't say that I don't like understand and even kind of like feel like I don't like listening to it, but at the same time, it's kind of like a Swan's effect where I'm just kind of like, me feeling pulverized and kind of annoyed is sort of the bit here, and it doesn't last long enough for me to be like, I don't like this. It's like, for as much as some parts of this project don't work, I still see the grand design of what Arca's going for. And that's the miraculous thing about this project, is that for as eclectic and crazy and weird as this whole thing is that there's an artistic clarity here that I really, really love.
Yeah, the kind of way that I've seen KicK 1 be described, and I think it's a kind of fairly accurate way of encapsulating it, it's essentially Arca's pop record. Like, essentially, this is the friendliest album in the series. It has a number of really high profile collaborators. Yeah, you get moments where the textures are just so unfathomably, you know, intense, but also you get a lot of friendly melodies popping up here. You get a lot
songs
of
like Time are just fucking show-stoppingly beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Songs as well, like one of my favorites here, Machote, as well, feels like a really great meeting point of some of Arca's more obtuse sort of sonic interests, and again, that kind of pop sensibility. You have an absolutely ball-busting collaboration with Rosalia here on KLK, which is actually maybe my favorite collaboration on this record. I think that Rosalia's voice and the way that she has like a much more conventionally pretty voice, but she's also able to kind of twist it into something that sounds alien in a way that really fits and aligns itself with the way that Arca uses her voice as well. Non-binary, as you mentioned, is this very declarative opener. I would say one of the ways in which okay, so Sophie and Arca do have a lot of sonic similarities, and I don't want to harp on it too much because I don't want it to become reductive. But you know, in a certain sense, like what we have had with Sophie's music is the intensity in a large part is really just kind of beating you to the ground and kind of representing a kind of sonic transfiguration of or rearranging of your DNA, like a kind of like a sonic representation of the malleability of form. And I think that Arca does that a lot too, but Arca has a distinct taste for atmospherics and for space within mixes as well.
Yeah.
Like even in her more abrasive and heavier moments, you get a real sense of like three-dimensionality in space in terms of where everything is placed. Non-binary displays that beautifully, despite being one of the more sparse tracks here, but you also have really, really intense moments like Watch as well, and like Rip the Slit too, which really just kind of just kind of burrow into your head like a drill. And I love that intensity so much. In ways, with the context of this entire project, KicK feels more like a prologue than like a real sort of definitive statement. Although I would also say it's maybe one of the examples of a record that maybe best sort of stands on its own, even without the rest of the trilogy. I think that there are certain other installments, which we'll get to, which benefit significantly from what the encasing of the other records. But I can see why KicK was released in isolation as kind of like a tester, and it seems fair to treat it as its own holistic project, but I think its significance deepens as we get further into the later records in this series. Let's dig into KicK, which was the first album of the big sort of drop that she did earlier this month, and probably one of the most confounding records in the entire series, because I would say it's the album that has the least clear identity. However, I've been thinking about this, and the utterly confounding nature of KicK, the way in which the first half of this record leans into a lot of influence from reggaeton and like dub influence and kind of like Latin influence, really most strongly felt in the first half of this record. And then the second half of this KicK record kind of gets much more abstract, peels a lot of that back.
Glitchy.
And then kind of ends with this bizarro collision of the Sia collaboration, Born Yesterday, and just the really kind of haunting ambient outro of Andro. And so you have this album that I think is indisputably, in my opinion, the most kind of fractured and least cohesive of the 5 records, and probably my least favorite on an individual level, a sentiment that I know that you share, Jake.
Yeah.
But I have been thinking about this, and it's like, you know, like it's fractured. Yes, it's not particularly cohesive, and yes, it's kind of a total fucking mess. But again, that almost feels like the point here, especially like it feels like Arca is deliberately trying to kind of like dislocate you, to kind of like make you feel like you have no idea where you sit, like where you're actually going to be heading and where you're actually going to be going. And it kind of relates to the themes that are expressed in a lot of the lyrics as well. Of course, themes of loss of identity confusion, but also of it's kind of seeking out and trying to build the confidence to exert yourself more freely, which I think is something that you get reflected in the third installment quite powerfully. You have a track like Araña at the center of this record, which is one of the more strange and sort of formless cuts, but it has these really intense textures that I love, that Arca is described as like being audio representations of like the limbs of a spider kind of crawling all over you. She describes the song as being an audio representation of a spider eating you and sucking the liquids outside of your insides. And one thing that she actually, I meant to mention this when we talked about non-binary on the first album, but there's a concept that Arca introduces at the very first song of this entire project back in non-binary that she then goes on to reference throughout the project. And that is the concept of the self-state. In that opening track, she says, "Speak for yourself states." And this is an idea that she alludes to and refers to, and I think is kind of like the defining concept of this entire project. It's a way of conceptualizing and defining a non-binary identity. It's Arca's own kind of concepts or idea of how that could be expressed, less as a clear, coherent, singular identity or mode that you exist within that happens to be outside of a gender binary, but as this kind of like constant, unfixed state where you are, or a series of states that you are able to kind of shift between, not dissimilar to the concept of mood, but much more kind of deeper and more personal than that. Arca believes very strongly in this idea of self states and this idea that you can exist in various different states interchangeably, sometimes simultaneously. That your identity can be comprised of, or can be conceptualized and defined in this more complex way as a series of self states that exist within you. And that concept, which is a really fascinating way of conceptualizing non-binary identity, I've been thinking about it a lot lately as I'm kind of like coming more and more to terms with my own non-binary identity. That concept is a really interesting one and reflects really interestingly on the structure of this entire project. So this 5-part project. I don't know that Arca sees the project itself in this way, but I feel like she kind of suggests it, where each of the 5 parts of the KicK series may represent a different self-state of Arca. And that's a really interesting idea that I've been trying to kind of view these records through that lens to see if they click more and more and more. And I think that they kind of do, because each record differs in the sorts of levels of confidences, of expressions, of emotions, of sexuality that they express. You have a very distinct cleaving. And to bring things back to KicK 2, yes, this is the least focused. Yes, this is the least coherent. And yes, this is the most kind of patchwork record in the series. But in a lot of senses, I feel it maybe best represents a particular self-state within Arca of conflict, of being torn between various aspects of her cultural identity as well. She refers a lot throughout these projects to her upbringing in South America and her decision to move to Barcelona. And obviously it's a bilingual project as well. Arca quite often switches between singing in Spanish and English. I think it is meaningful that this record is the one that includes the Sia collaboration, the most clearly Americanized piece of music on this entire project, alongside the most reggaeton, the most Latin influenced music on this same record. I think that that's meaningful that these different things coexist here. And so the theme of KicK 2 for me, I still have certain issues with it, you know, and I still think it's probably the least exciting of the 5 installments, but that idea of cultural conflict and of cultural transmogrification feels like it is feels like that is the point of this particular project. And that idea of Arca's self-state of multiplicity and beyond just gender, but in terms of like, you know, the places in the world that she belongs to and the people that she belongs to is expressed really beautifully here before you get the following installments, which feel much less torn between different things and much clearer in the identity that they express. Jake, I'm curious what you think of this project, what you think of the songs on it, and what you think of my self-state theory, I guess.
No, I think that's perfectly on point. This is the sort of moment where you sort of begin to see the matrix, as it were. But like, the interesting thing about a lot of this too is that like, how violent and aggressive Arca takes her sound in ways. Like the opening track here, Danya, like I can't emphasize enough for those who haven't heard this. This song is disgusting. This song sounds like you are like hearing flesh being ripped off of bones. Like there is a sense of like biological tissue and matter being ripped apart, stripped back together, put together. Like each one of these albums feels as though it deconstructs and reconstructs something in real time. And this is the most like active one where that feels like the case. And that sort of aimlessness that Tyler described in the sort of lack of unification, and that like simultaneously, I do agree that this is probably the weakest part of the project, mainly for it being in that, like, yes, it's a mess, but I like that it's a mess. I think that it should be a mess because that aimlessness is how it's reflected. It's really that a lot of these tracks, especially in the first half, are kind of the same kind of mess, is that a lot of them just kind of blur together as being very similar songs, and until that really like glitchy and abstract element comes in, a lot of them feel like they just sort of have a lack of distinct identity that I think would have really made them stand out more. There's no single point on here where I think there's like a bad song or anything. Like, to be blunt with you, even though I really, really like the last project and think that it's a little bit better than this one, is that the only 2 songs on this entire 5 album long span that I don't enjoy are on KicK 1. I think the rest of the project is broadly excellent. But like here, there is a distinct effort to just sort of display a valley of contrasts. It's like Tyler said, I think that the sort of way that it stays in that sort of unfocused territory for that first half, and then does kind of change in that glitchiness. It's like there's like a distinct science fiction body horror element to the sound of this album that really unifies its themes in a way that I find really, really exciting.
And that
once
body
that
horror
glitchiness-
element, sorry to interrupt you, that body
No.
horror element, just while you mention it, is very reflected in the cover art too.
Yes,
I mean, the different
very much
covers art,
informs that.
the different cover arts of all the KicK series kind of play with that idea of kind of like body modification and like
Yes.
limbs and stuff being torn apart. But you can almost see that, I think, most viscerally on the cover for KicK 2, where you have like Arca herself kind of like with these sort of extended sort of like Dr. Octopus-esque limbs coming off of her, and this kind of like corpse beside her that she's like...
Yeah, there's like clones and like different versions of her that are like altered and modified, and all of them are biomechanical and gross. And it's like the music perfectly reflects how this feels, and that it's like kind of ugly. And like, in a sense, I think what Arca's doing here is genuinely transgressive in making something this dedicated to alienation, this dedicated to singularity, and this dedicated to just like she really doesn't give a fuck about the listener here. And that's something that, of course, may not fly with somebody who, like our podcast mates or something, that may make covering this an absolute nightmare for somebody like them. And it doesn't always work when it comes to the cohesiveness of this project. But like, if you listen to the first part of this, that's a good litmus test to like see if you're in for the rest of it. Because if like you really like that KicK 1 thing, it's worth sitting through the dodgier or rougher parts of KicK 2 to sort of see where all of this takes you and to see where it all congeals together. Is that there's a lot of stuff here that can seem really unfriendly. That everything here is really like, all these reggaeton pieces are super, they're really, really aggressive. And I really like when they sort of lean into how like jagged this particular sound is, just because like, while the reggaeton influence is like super distinct and like you can't argue that it's anything else, it's very much Arca's brand of this sound. Like nothing else in that genre is going to sound like this does, which is awesome. And then when that glitchy abstract element comes in, it feels like everything has branched out from the first part and then has found something that unifies it together, and then it sort of comes together on Born Yesterday, which is a beautiful song. Despite the fact that Sia has had a questionable year this year in terms of artistic decisions, her vocal presence here on this is fantastic, and the actual like instrumental arrangement is gorgeous, and Andro really does a great job of it doesn't really like wipe the slate clean, but it like feels like everything that was like liquidy and slimy and gross has like congealed into something else. And then it's sort of like leading into the part 3 of whatever this is.
I'm glad that you like Born Yesterday, Jake, because I like it too. And I've actually seen that song get a lot of flack online. And I guess it's just that people were like, Sia on my Arca album. But it's actually just a really, really good...
It's no less weird than Björk or fucking later Ryuichi Sakamoto showing up. But
yeah, for sure.
That's sort of, again, you got to appreciate here the contrast and the polarity that Arca is going for. It's just because like, it's not even necessarily to create something that doesn't sound like anything. It's to say something about the different ways these sounds attack each other and the way they antagonistically kind of grind against not only themselves, but against you, the listener. And it makes for a really engaging, active listening experience. This isn't really something to put on in the background or enjoy kind of passively. This is something that you kind of got to sit down and really soak in to just sort of feel the griminess of it.
Absolutely agree. And one of the things I love about that song Born Yesterday is, even though it's adapted from an old demo that Sia wrote that was originally pitched to be like a pop song, Arca's kind of really taken it and making it her own. And there's like this beautiful element to it. So I didn't know this until I started doing my homework, and apparently there's a piano melody in the song that Arca has been waiting to use in a piece of music ever since she was a child. And she chose to use it here because I think the song is kind of about aging, and the song is kind of about growing up, and the process of growing up making you more and more and more forced to reckon with the ways in which you're seen by the people who've been in your life since you were a child, your parents, or by your family, or by the people who are so fundamentally used to seeing you in a certain way that you are just not anymore. Right. And when I'm going through a particular period at the moment where I'm like really coming out as non-binary more and more and more, but I'm also like, it's Christmas time, I'm with my family, none of them know about that. So I'm like hyper conscious of the fact that I'm being perceived by everyone around me in a way that's completely different to how I'm perceiving myself. And that's obviously a fundamental part of the trans experience for most people. But this song, I think, really beautifully expresses it. Like, in the way that Sia sings is so potent and powerful in terms of the righteous kind of anger and just upset emotion of how you feel when you want to be able to say, I can see the look on your face. I can see that you don't see me the way that I want you to. And you know, and it's a song just about like, don't patronize me, don't condescend to me, don't pretend, you know, I'm not your baby anymore. Again, that idea of aging, of growing up, of now you've grown up into an adult and you've like reformed and taken charge of your own identity, and you're trying to convince those people that you aren't their child anymore, and you haven't ever been. And that's, you know, it's a song that I've just seen people kind of tossing out because Sia's on it, and there's just a lot in there, I think, that's quite meaningful in terms of the concept of this project.
You're so correct. And honestly, I feel like what you just said is perfectly integral to at least how I've come to understand the project. And like, you know, we talk about it like in all these abstract terms and how this project is super duper weird and all, but I think the way that it flows from song to song, and then sort of like, it sort of arrives at moments like this where it takes a step back and lets you, like, there's like a more digestible song here, something like Born Yesterday, which is a really tangibly emotional sounding song. Like, the tonality of Sia's voice when she says something like mistakes are part of life, it's so rawly passionate. And like, I think that basically the point here is to have all of these instrumental movements sort of cascade into one another and enhance these moments here by these sort of abstract pieces. And like, and it just makes them all the more meaningful and makes them feel like they're, you know, even higher of an instrumental and emotional high when they come along. And that's what makes this project really interesting, is that I feel as though it really understands how to sort of balance that, even though it's obviously like, you know, it's about 95% weird abstract shit and then 5% more concretely enjoyable shit. But it makes that 5%, not to say the 95% is not enjoyable, it very, very much is, but the 5%, it really is trying to enhance and make that sort of concision that I talked about earlier when it comes to Arca's sound really hit even harder. And that's why the whole thing is super great. I wanted to sort of emphasize that on this part, is because, yeah, this is like the weakest part, but I still think it has a great grasp on what the project on a macro level is trying to do.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think on that note, we should dive straight in then to the central part of this project, the centerpiece, the part that seems to be getting the most adoration
shit.
and love. Yeah, exactly. KicK 3, which is, bar none, the most fucking heavy, intense shit Arca's ever made consistently. Like, it gives you a little bit of a reprieve at the very end, but for the most part, this installment of the KicK series is wig snatching. Like, it is just genuinely fucking terrifying at certain points. Exactly. Like, this is Arca, this is the South state of Arca that is its most confident, its most sexual, its most violent, its most charged in terms of like intensity and just animosity in certain senses as well. Like, I mean, with Bruja, the first track here, the way that this project kicks off, and this might, I don't know, I haven't actually tried to really think about what my favorite tracks of this whole project are, but this is certainly one of them. This is absolutely absurdly hard. Like, holy fucking shit. Again, we have Arca switching between Spanish and English, and then when she is, in both cases, she's just absolutely tearing into the listener and giving promises of sexual domination that are just equally arousing and just genuinely make you fear for your life. She sings lines like, "Hush it while I lick my bloody claws, cuddly fur, sharpened paws, did I stutter, hear me roar, while I'm shitting on the pavement." I love the way that Arca kind of, as well as really leaning into the extreme sexual stuff, she also utilizes like just disgusting ideas and imagery, like just the idea of the profane and the, like literally like excreting and like shitting and like just
one of the final lines on one of these songs is with her just saying like lunch meat, and it's like,
oh ew.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
Absolutely. And Bruja very much lays out to you in no uncertain terms what KicK 3 is going to be, and the rest of the project sees Arca building upon that and exploring that and through various just of some of the hardest and most awesome beats that she's ever constructed, some absolutely just killer lyricism and just vocal performances as well that truly bring a sense of alienness out of Arca. The way that she uses vocal effects and the way that she uses her vocal presence has always been a big part of that throughout her entire career, but you get more and more and more of that here. I want to focus in on one of the tracks on this record, which I think is maybe the most important track here in terms of the concept, which is the song Electra Rex, where she evokes this Freudian idea, right? So the Electra complex is the Freudian complex of the woman's psychosexual competition with her mother for ownership of her father. It is the kind of polar female equivalent of the Oedipus complex. And of course, the Rex is a reference to the Sophocles play Oedipus Rex, which tells the story of Oedipus. And so with the term Electra Rex, Arca has essentially kind of like smashed together these two ideas, and to the point of this is to essentially give you an idea of, the point of this is to reflect Arca's sexual liberation by essentially invoking the idea of murdering both of her parents and essentially possessing both of her parents at the same time. This idea of total self-control, this idea of total seizure of the self, again, which you have already seen hinted at in the song like Born Yesterday on the last record. And it feels like here she realizes that it's total domination of yourself. It's total ownership of yourself. It is total consumption and fucking destruction of anyone who would try to or feel entitled to have ownership over you. It is this idea of the self as this total fucking sexual entity of sheer control. It is Arca's top anthem. Like, it is so meaningful. I mean, the second verse opens with the lines, "Electra Rex knife sex, wet and hot and heavy while we smash the test." on the back of my throat, you're pressing my clit and my pedals are heavy. You're ready to blow. Should I blow? Like the knife sex evocation is so powerful as well, because this is something that a lot of trans artists evoke, which is this idea of like violence through like the actual like cutting and mutilation of the flesh to reflect like the body horror and, you know, dysphoria as well, and the idea of, you know, castration as a means of like sexual self-determination, and you know, muddling images of, you know, male mutilation, female mutilation, to kind of realize this non-binary archetype that Arca's trying to archetype, literally, that she's trying to construct. And then also the knife sex itself image, not just being about like, you know, sexual like gender, but also just being about like the violence of the sexual expression that comes with being transgender for Arca in certain self states anyway. Like the perception of trans people as sexual predators as well is something that is alluded to here too, that perception. And then I think that at points Arca kind of like leans into that to kind of make a point about that stereotype and about how harmful it is, and about, well, if you're going to see me in this way, I'm going to be this fucking, you know, demonic, violent, evil creature. So yeah, there's just so many ideas about sex and gender and expression just absolutely piled into these songs. Like you would have, it would take hours to parse them fully, but I'm kind of giving you, the listeners, a taste of what is suggested here that you can kind of dig into further yourselves if you want to. But Arca's idea of sexuality, of her identity, of her self state, of how she expresses herself is multiplicitous, is multifaceted in so many different ways, as it should be. And yeah, the beauty of KicK is that I think a lot of people respond to is the immediacy of the way in which Arca throws that in your face and makes it both exhilarating and terrifying and just so much fun.
I think it's probably difficult to argue that this is, on face value at least, the most well-rounded of all 5 of the albums. I think this is the one that contains the most like diversity, but like it retains being very holistic. It's like, basically it's like the most balanced of all the projects. It doesn't lean that far into like any of the extremities that are gone for on this sound. It kind of feels like, if you're a weird fucking nerd like me, I start to view this album in terms of like geometric sort of halves, in a way, in the sense that like this album next to KicK feels like a deliberate choice of being like, you have KicK, which is the messiest, and then you have KicK, which is the most focused. And then you sort of like, and then sonically speaking, you have the 2 albums that follow this are like the 2 most like different sounding records in this project. And you sort of have this at the very middle here. It's like, it's all arranged in such a way that makes it feel like it's a deliberate structural choice, which is super cool. And I think this is because Tyler already spoke so well as to like the actual sort of content and sort of what you're in for. And I think the word of the day with KicK is definitely exhilarating. This is definitely the most continuously exciting and interesting project. And while I would say again that like the best litmus test is still with KicK to see if you're going to enjoy it, is that if you generally speaking sort of enjoy this kind of music, give this a shot too. Maybe even if KicK doesn't sort of tickle your fancies, because this is genuinely some of the most aggro, ridiculous sounding shit. I mean, like, call it like it is. This is basically IDM. It's body horror IDM, and it's fucking awesome. I wouldn't even say it's my favorite of the projects, but it's definitely the one that's the most satisfying to listen to. And I think that's because like when you hear it, especially, or at least when I hear it, it almost feels wrong to like hear it outside of the setting of being like, you feel like it might just be because I have Matrix on the brain, but like this feels like the soundtrack to the Hell Club from the Matrix Revolutions. Like this is the kind of shit that everybody in BDSM and leather they're all dressed up to just absolutely, to just, you know, get on the dance floor and, you know, fuck and dance and do whatever the fuck they want. And this is the soundtrack. The bass here, like generally speaking, Arca's production is basically flawless. Like I never have a word wrong to say about anything she does when it comes to like the sound of what she's going for. It's always like, even if it's some of the messier stuff on KicK 2, I wouldn't change anything about the way that it sounds necessarily. Is that this is an immaculate showcase of balancing the spacier and the more claustrophobic production, just because these songs will like switch up and be like, some of them are basically structureless. Like the song Skull Queen is one of the bug nuttiest pieces of music I've heard all year long. Like, I still can't get over how many weird digressions and weird sounds that this particular song has, and how weirdly catchy it is. This is just a, like, if you're a fucking freak and you want something really weird to enjoy, and you know, maybe you need something to dance alone in your room to, this is definitely gonna get the job done. But it's also like, at the very end, it sort of peels back and like does something. I won't say that it like even there's like a departure in sound, but like there's definitely a departure in like, there's a lot more clarity, I think, at the very, very end. Like the rest of it sounds very like cluttered. There's lots of moving parts. There's lots of things that you have to digest about the songs that you're listening to. There's a density to all of this, and it's like, it's hitting you and you feel like a fucking pinball in a machine, and you're just like, ah, fuck. And then at the very end, there's sort of again, it's kind of like how KicK 2 sort of gradually finds itself. This album does too, and it sort of pushes itself to a more linear progression at the very, very end, which beautifully segues into KicK 4.
Indeed it does. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the way that this ends, because I think the closer on KicK 3, Joya, is one of the most beautiful pieces in the whole series. It's just gorgeous and feels like it's like the aftermath of this, you know, violent, aggressive sex where you're just like feeling so cradled and loved. And it does go into KicK 4, which is unquestionably the most underappreciated installment of this series. Like,
hell fucking yes, it is.
It is currently the lowest rated on Rate Your Music. I think it's just generally the least talked about as well. And that, I mean, to some extent, I get it. This is like what we're going to get to when we get to KicK 5, which is just the most kind of spare and stripped back and sparse and ambient sort of record. This feels like a very, very necessary step along the journey to that conclusion. It is a record where the intensity of KicK 3 is peeled back, but still sort of like, it still kind of haunts certain parts of this record. But generally, this is a more kind of reflective project. This is a more introspective project. This represents a self-state for Arca that is much less kind of aggressive and much less kind of confident and much more sort of questioning. And it has some of the most unusual and unique and idiosyncratic pieces of sound design across this whole project. It has some of the most devastating moments of this entire project. Jake, I can tell you feel pretty strongly about this one too. What is it about this project that has really struck you and that you really respond to?
Basically, it's all about that contrast I was talking about. After the most direct, the most easy to digest, but also the most fun sort of project in this series with KicK 3, you immediately have something that strips everything back and kind of comes at this sound with a really stark minimalism. I would describe most of what this sounds like as being borderline like ambient pop at times. It's a lot slower. It's a lot more contemplative. It has just as many moving parts, but it's never with the same effect. And, you know, I'll be honest, I genuinely think this is my favorite part in the project. It's because once we get here, once you have moved through the previous three parts of the conflict, that afterglow that Tyler described, I feel like, you know, like the post-coital, like you kind of feel cradled and held. That's what this is. It's extending that feeling into an entire project. And just because it's on the slower side, or just because it's on the less aggressive side, I mean, it really sort of, in my opinion at least, the reception of this just sort of fails to consider where this figures in, but also just lacks to appreciate the density and overall the intricacy of songs here. I think like the beginning of something like the 1-2 punch of Horse Song and Asuna are like, is gorgeous, gorgeous, beautiful sounding. And then you follow it up with something like Xenomorph Girl, which is just, I mean, maybe my favorite song on this entire project. It's in contention with some of the stuff on KicK 5. I'll give it that much. But there's just like a way that like Arca's brazen dedication to having no holds barred and just being like, I'm just going to make a collection of songs here which just do not sound or serve the purpose that anything I made before does. Because with all of the contrasts of the first 3 parts is that you can take individual songs, like tons of them from each one, and if you isolate them, they can serve sort of the same purpose of being like these really like sort of danceable, weird blends of hodgepodgey genre, techno, IDM, dance, fucking industrial craziness, and you can sort of see how in isolation they are similar to one another. But here, this is completely different. Like if you're listening to this and you have no idea where it's going to go beforehand, this comes out of nowhere. And as a result, I really appreciated it just because it makes the project more holistic. It sort of fleshes out an element of the sound that isn't there before. But it also creates a mood and a tone and atmosphere that makes everything here it makes the aggressive parts feel all the stronger, and it makes everything that comes after it feel all that more defined and all that more shaped. Everything here feels like it's sort of meant to not even necessarily like comfort you, but it's like, it's sort of a like a regression, a sort of like you almost feel like you're in a fetal state waiting to be reborn after you've been dissected and torn apart and put back together again on the other 3 albums. And it makes that journey and that sort of like body horror that's really like fucking visceral about the rest of this project feel as though it all had a purpose, and it all kind of culminates on this part, which is why it ends up being my favorite, I think.
Yeah, there's the thing I love about this particular project is KicK 3 has shown us the confidence of Arca's expression, the kind of like her ability to express herself in the most kind of unguarded and even defiant of ways. Whereas KicK 4, I think, reflects a different aspect of Arca's sort of self-love and self-confidence in herself, which is her giving herself permission to be tender, her giving herself permission to be vulnerable. There's a key song here, the single from this record, the song Queer, which is a collaboration with Planning to Rock, has this lyrical refrain of, I got tears, but they're tears of fire. They're tears of power. And that is a kind of beautiful sentiment because it expresses and reflects this idea that in order to be, that you can be powerful, that you can be expressive, that you can be defiant through vulnerability, through peeling back the facade that you have to put up, through just the, allowing the completely uncovered alien inside to be revealed. Like it is, 4 is a really essential project in the arc of this progression because it is about learning to be yourself, learning to be comfortable with expressing yourself without feeling you have to fit a particular mold or perform in a particular way to be accepted as a trans person or whatever. It is about the journey to acceptance and embrace of pure self-expression, regardless of conformity or expectations or fitting into particular molds. It's triumphant in that way. And I think there are moments on this project that really feel triumphant through that lens. Like my favorite track on this particular project, which is Lost Woman Found, which feels like one of the most just emotional and just beautiful. And the sentiment here is so powerful. This idea of, I've been walking so long. The first time I felt the sun on my skin, it is my own now, a lost woman found. You can find out on your own what it means to be mutant, what it means to recognize the alien inside. Like it's this incredibly beautiful sentiment of like, in order to be truly yourself, You do not have to be this idealized, beautiful thing. You can embrace the mutant. You can, again, take the language of the oppressors, or take the way in which you're seen as this kind of profane thing, and you can, instead of rejecting that, you can kind of embrace that and turn that into a powerful strength of yourself. And that's something I think Arca has expressed throughout her career. I mean, but it feels like it's being realized more and more as this triumphant thing here. I am absolutely adore the beautiful kind of like electric guitar interlude of Alien Inside, with Shirley Manson of the grunge band Garbage providing vocals. And she just gives this sort of spoken word sentiment where she talks about being a star, like being a soft memory turning away from starlight to self, the first death, the last birth, the first time you recognize the alien inside in the face of abject misery. You remember the post-human celestial sparkle, your vanity or your sanctuary. So really, really potent, powerful expressions and ideas and images here of self-realization. The celestial sparkle is a concept that you'll have, the idea of like existing as a form that is kind of universal, that transcends the planet and is kind of more celestial, is a kind of sentiment I've seen expressed in a lot of music by trans artists. And yeah, my feelings on this are a bit all over the place. But I just do think this is genuinely a beautiful and meaningful and moving part of the series. And I think a really, really, really important one too. The whole project would kind of collapse without it. I think it really needs this part of the progression. And I love as well in the closing track on this part, Poor, where it's like the this kind of animalistic sort of sexual domination aspect of KicK 3, you get the kind of tender counterpoint to that. You get Arca intoning to her lover to come and be her dog, but not in a kind of violent sexual way, in a way where it's like, I want to give you warmth. I want to give you cuddles. I want to love you. I want warmth. When you want warmth, I want warmth too. It's
like an actual dominant, submissive, healthy relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it recognizes the true complexity and beauty and nuance of a relationship dynamic that is often rendered very two-dimensionally in music and in art. So yeah, it's beautiful. And even the most esoteric and bizarre parts of this record, like the track Alter, which I think is the lowest rated track on the whole set of albums, which is so absurd to me.
Stupid.
Because I love the beauty and the tenderness and the effects and the just general alien feel of this piece. And the lyrics are so beautiful. After all, you still lost me. I still lost you too. Do you recall the night that you looked into my eyes, inside to me? You said angel, and I did. It's like a meeting of Arca's dead past self with her current, realized self. Or it's a song about finding true tenderness in a lover. There are a lot of songs across this project where Arca refers to her partner. There are a couple of songs where she refers to him by name. And there's just a genuine sense of comfort and love throughout this whole project. Like, so much is said about Arca's like fuck you mentality of just like pure raw violence, but that is only there in as much as the tenderness is too. And the dynamic between those extremities and the gray area in between, the complex gray area in between those extreme poles, is such a core part of Arca's music and musical identity. And so in that sense, a record like KicK 4 and its relation to the records that precede it is so important to who Arca is and to what Arca is doing musically with this project.
If you thought that the transition from part 3 to part 4 was a bit of an ass kicker, boy howdy, is the transition from 4 to 5 even more of a, I'm sorry?
I mean,
Fucking excuse me?
I wasn't expecting that.
For this to be a fucking modern classical fucking
It,
segment of music.
it's like modern classical music through electroacoustic instrumentation. It
I
is
believe it's called post minimalism on Rate Your Music.
I mean, sure, bro. I'll drink to that.
I mean, look, it's got a Ryuichi Sakamoto feature, and not in the way that you might expect, but like the Ryuichi Sakamoto influence on this part is unmistakable, frankly.
Yeah, and the electroacoustic instrumentation of many of the songs on this record, like for instance, the first major song here, Pew, like that, the tonality and the electroacoustic textures that are used very much have a lot of precedence in electronic music and remind me of artists like Square Pusher even, but totally rendered through the, again, modern classical minimalist lens of artists like Sakamoto and even artists like Philip Glass to a certain extent as well.
Yeah.
The influence of through this, and Steve Reich, and I could probably list names for ages. But of course, the beauty of this, the reason why it's such a successful end to the series is that it still feels like Arca through and through, and it is the sort of denouement that a project like this deserves, that a project like this earns, and it really ties a bow on the whole thing. Like, I completely could understand, like, my first time experiencing these records, I was so bewildered by them and so utterly perplexed as to how they all fit together the first time I experienced them. But this, hearing KicK 5 and appreciating it as the conclusion, was really the first step for me in beginning to unlock what this whole series is doing. Again, the idea of the self-states that Arca is taking you through, these different coexisting, sometimes interchangeable, sometimes simultaneous ways of being that Arca experiences, and the way in which, again, we talked about how KicK 4 reveals a tenderness and a comfort within vulnerability that Arca learns to realize. And then KicK 5 is like the ultimate embrace of that. It is utter tenderness. It is utter beauty. It is utter love. It is the most lyrically sparse record of the 5, but the lyrics that are here are almost unequivocally sentiments of beautiful love and adoration and tenderness and comfort. Many of them are in Spanish, but one of the most pointed tracks here lyrically, Tierno, which I had to translate to understand what was being said, is just one of the most lovely love songs that I've heard in such a long time. Ever since I met you, I had no time to prepare myself for such tenderness. Since I saw you for the first time, I didn't know what was happening to me, that so much tenderness would flourish in me towards a stranger, but not for long. And once again, I fear what could happen. I don't want to question this, but I've been through too much. I feel your tenderness towards me. I keep it. I'm keeping it. I deserve it. Like, fuck, I just absolutely wept reading those lyrics and listening to this piece of music. And I think it's meaningful that Arca sings it in Spanish as well, because it shows that level of connection and intimacy between her and her partner, who I believe is Spanish. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that they have a similar sort of cultural background as well. So yeah, that's just such a beautiful kind of conclusion to this arc of not only embracing the tenderness as a part of your identity that is just as beautiful and valid as the, dominant, expressive self, but saying that not only is that part of yourself okay, but you also are allowed to, and indeed deserve to, be able to experience that love and tenderness from others as well, which is something that I believe a lot of trans people and a lot of non-binary people and a lot of people in general who struggle with their sexuality or identity, that's a big thing to accept a lot of the time, is that you're deserving of love and that the person giving you love genuinely feels that love for you. That's something that your brain and that the people in the world around you can make it very difficult to understand and accept. But the beautiful conclusion of this entire series is Arca's acceptance of that. And it's just stunning.
it's also a beautiful sort of mirror reflection of like how the first one is the sort of accessible kind of the pop album, and this almost feels like it's a complete reflection of that, and that it's, you know, this really minimal, very plaintive, very gentle kind of thing that's like, it's a lot more meditative and a lot more beautiful, and sort of overall fits into the whole, like, you know, you have the center of you have the third part of the arc of the records, and then you have sort of 2 and 4 mirroring each other in the messiness and the cohesiveness and the disparate tones, and then you have 1 and 5 mirroring each other in the accessible kind of maximal parts of Arca's sound, and then the minimal parts and the gentle parts of Arca's sound.
And that is made, I've been waiting to mention this, that mirroring is made explicit on the track Estrogen, which I didn't pick up on. I didn't pick up on this.
I love this song.
I didn't pick up on this until listening to this just before we recorded. But Estrogen takes the melody from the song Me Que Trefe on the first record and reuses it. And when I realized that these songs have the same melody, it's a literal full circle moment. And it just absolutely floored me. It absolutely blew my mind, because Me Que Trefe is a song about like self-confidence and learning to be able to express yourself in public, and being able to kind of shut out the, you know, abuse that you might receive in that context. And then Estrogen is like the gorgeous self-calm that comes from that, the ability to do that and the acceptance. And it's just an instrumental. Again, many tracks on this record are instrumentals, but you feel through the arc of this project, especially if you listen to the records in succession, when you do get to an instrumental, you can often just get a very intuitive sense of what Arca is trying to communicate, just from the way the songs sound, from the way the melody conducts itself, from the feeling that you get. And for that to come and be expressed there is so, so beautiful. And then this fucking final record just kind of keeps going to more and more beautiful, beautiful places. It concludes with 2 of the best tracks on the entire project, in my opinion, Fire Prayer and Crown. Fire Prayer is absolutely gobsmacking. Like the beauty.
I mean, you talked about Philip Glass earlier.
I mean, the beauty in this is unreal. It is just utterly stunning. There's a moment in the song where this kind of piano melody comes in, and it's like the most conventional musical element in maybe the entire series, but the way that it's deployed is just maximizes the devastation of the melody itself and the counter melodies in the song too. Like the melodic core of this is just perfection. And then you get the closer here, Crown, which I can't imagine a better way of wrapping all of this up. It feels like, again, it's the most maximal song on this final part of the series. It really feels like the conclusion, and reflects, again, the ideas of form and confidence and of identity. The refrain of "she wears her crown," again, the kind of regal imagery and invocation that a lot of queer people use in their art and in songs that are written about confidence and self-expression. And how could it fit inside a body so petite as well? That idea of something larger and grander and bigger than a single form could contain being expressed and coming to light and being released from the body itself. It's like, it feels truly like the coronation of Arca's inner self, of Arca's ultimate being. And it's just a flooring ending to this project.
Oh yeah, I couldn't have said all that better myself. I'll just shout out that upon reflection, I think if I had to pick a favorite piece from this entire project, I'd say that goes to iiiii. iiiii is a fucking incredibly gorgeous piece of music that I just I'm enamored with it. It's again, it's very in keeping with the entirety of KicK 5. I think that it's probably like the most emblematic piece of music on that entire record, sort of embodies it the best. But it is just, this is one of the easiest, if I do go back to just parts of this without revisiting the whole thing, which I have done a couple times just because I wanted to isolate my thoughts on each one. But this is the easiest one for me to go to sort of like as its own thing, like as a kind of ambient record. It's just really easy to enjoy like that, which to some extent, I feel that way about pretty much all 5 of these, is that you can enjoy them on their own. I do think that the proper way to enjoy them is of a piece like with all of the other ones. But after you do that, you can sort of understand them more on their own and sort of recontextualize them and put them back together. And I also have to note that if Tyler was going to be on brand and mention mention Autechers, that I'll be on brand and mention that this is even more far-reaching, but like it obviously wasn't an influence, but Fire Prayer really reminds me of a song off of Porcupine Trees in Absentia. It reminds me of the very beginning, the harp on oh god, what the fuck is the fucking third song on that album? Lips of Ashes. It reminds me of the harp. You sort of hear how it's existing in this huge space, like that kind of mixing technique where it evokes that like really spacious, like it's like being recorded in a cathedral and those strings are like really dense. Like that's exactly what that sounds like. It evoked that and I was just like, oh yes. So good.
Yeah, and I mean, on that note as well, if I may circle back to my Autechre comparison, I mean, not only is this sort of structure here broadly, this idea of the 5-part series that represents one sort of singular project, an obvious kind of surface comparison, but you even have similarities in the ways in which these projects musically progress. Like in both instances, the first installment is kind of like the most accessible to a certain extent, like it's the kind of most sort of declarative of purpose. And then the second installment in both is kind of like the most sort of complicated and least sort of, and the biggest sort of grower in the series and the most sort of dense and strange in terms of its unconventional sound design. The third and fourth are kind of like, this is kind of where the comparison gets a bit muddled, because KicK 3 reminds me more of LSEC 4, and then KicK 4 reminds me more of LSEC 3, but they're both kind of like have a duality of one is like the abrasive in your face one with the most kind of like stark and violent melodies and just sheer raw intensity, and the other is a more kind of reflective and beautiful. And then in both instances, the series end with their 5th installment, which is the most sort of ambient and calm and kind of like conventionally beautiful, that ties a whole bow on the arc of the journey that you've experienced. And so, yeah, LSEC, for those who don't know, is essentially my favorite record of all time. And so I was always going to be on board with exploring what Arca was doing here. And for the record, I've not necessarily always been consistently 100% there with Arca. I don't necessarily connect with some of her earlier projects as much as this more recent stuff. But this feels like a full arrival for Arca as a musician, but also for me in terms of appreciating and connecting with Arca's work more than ever before. And that may not even be anything to do with the music. That may just be because of where I'm at in my life now compared to where I have been, where I'm more in a place where it's easier for me to kind of click with and accept and get onto Arca's wavelength. And maybe you feel the same, Jake, as well, considering the way that you bumped up your KicK 1 rating. There's just
I do.
There's just a sense in which I think that this kind of project has come along for me at such a perfect time, and it's been part of the reason why I've been exploring myself and my identity more and more in the last few weeks. But yeah, anyway, beautiful series, beautiful project that I think is only going to age better and better and better, and will truly stand as one of the most impressive achievements in electronic music of the last 10 years, up there with the gods themselves. So yeah, I mean,
that's honestly like the cool thing about like the time period in which we live, and the whole, just the idea of gender exploration, what have you, is that it exists within online spaces, and sort of this this idea of the kind of being able to expand and explore and understand the self through purely metaphysical and artistic means. And it like just the fact that Arca as an artist is exists and makes music and projects like this of this scale, that makes me so happy. Like, even if I didn't like any of this, it is an unequivocally amazing thing that it exists. And, you know, if this even vaguely sounds like it could be up your alley, please give it a shot. It really is worth it, and it really is rewarding. I'd say that, like, I really love all of this, and I'm still going to be listening to it in the coming year a lot. Maybe not quite as much as Tyler or anything, but like, even so, I think this is one of the most worthwhile musical journeys I've had this year, and it's been a good fucking year.
All right, well, now let's, instead of going through our favorite tracks from each record, I thought what we could do is just list our 10 favorite songs from this entire project as a whole. So, Jake, why don't you go? What are your 10 favorite songs on KicK 1 through 5?
My 10 favorites got to be Time, Watch, Lethargy, Born Yesterday, Skull Queen, Joya, Xenomorph Girl, Isuna, and Ether, and Fire Prayer.
All right, my 10 favorite songs are, just in order of appearance on the album, KLK, No Quere Nada, Luna Lena, Born Yesterday, Bruja, Senorita, Boki Fluya, Lost Woman Found, Tierno, and Fire Prayer. And man, I just realized when I said Senorita that I never even got to talk about the "I'll piss in your hole and then fuck it" line in that song, which I wanted to mention this. It kind of goes without saying, but that's like banger of the year material, that song.
Yeah,
like that song just literally fucking goes so hard.
And
I've listened to it so much just on its own.
It's so good.
All right, so now let's rate the individual projects and then give a final rating to the project as a whole. So, Jake, what are your ratings for the 5 individual KicK installments and the overarching project as a whole?
Well, as you may have noticed, I'm a pretty big fan, and I think this is pretty consistently excellent. So if I had to give a rating to each individual part, I would give KicK 1 an 8 out of 10, KicK 2 a 6 out of 10, KicK 3 an 8 out of 10, KicK 4 an 8.5 out of 10, and KicK 5 an 8.5 out of 10. And if I had to rate all of this as one project, I would give it a 9 out of 10.
Beautiful. Well, my rating, so I'm going to give KicK 1 an 8.5 out of 10. I'm going to give KicK 2 a 6.5 out of 10. I'm going to give KicK 3 a 9 out of 10. I'm going to give KicK 4 an 8.5 out of 10. And I'm going to give KicK 5 a 9 out of 10. And my rating for the entire project is also a 9 out of 10. So well done.
Hell yeah.
Excellent shit. So let us know at home what you think of Arca's KicK project. If you've heard it, if you haven't heard it, go and check it out. Even if you don't want to listen to the whole thing, go and listen to whichever record
You're
sounds like.
Transphobic if you don't listen to it.
I'm leaving that in the video. Yeah, no, even if you don't want to listen to the whole thing just yet, pick out one of the records that sounds the most interesting to you and give it a shot. And let us know what you think in the comments below. Let us know what your favorite record is. Let us know what you think of each individual record, how you'd rank them, your favorite songs, what you think of our takes on the records, what you think of Arca's concept, anything, any thoughts you have on the KicK project, please let us know in the comments below. We love to hear from you. Make sure, if you haven't already, you go and check out the list videos we just dropped on our favorite and least favorite music of the year, and also check out the video we did on Sophie's Oil of Every Pearl's Uninsides as well. I'll make sure that's linked in the description below too. If you like the video, please hit the like button. Really helps us a lot if you could do that. If you enjoy what we do and you haven't already subscribed, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you enjoy what we do and you want to help us out a little bit more, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us and help us to be able to do what we do. And And you also get a shout out in each video that we make, and you also get priority comment responses and more perks that will be coming in the new year as well. So entirely up to you, but if you enjoy what we do, then those options are there for you. Again, we want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and or happy holidays, and stick around for more exciting stuff coming very, very soon. Follow us on Twitter to be updated as soon as new videos are announced and released. And yeah, as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, L'Oreal, because you're worth it.